including Betty, who says, "Morning, Peter. Wes Streeting's comments are inflammatory and clearly show this government has decided that it will side against the 95% of this country on any topic. Luckily, there's only 45,000 left in the army and 100,000 police will side with the people. This government is only interested in the 500 to 1,000 votes in their seats." Well, Wes Streeting is under pressure in his seat. He said the grooming gang's rhetoric risks inciting massacre. Streeting, that is the headline in The Guardian today, spoken to them. 528 majority in Ilford South, which is his constituency. The use of inflammatory language over grooming gangs risks vilifying entire communities and could lead to atrocities such as the mosque massacre in New Zealand that killed more than 50 people, according to the Health Secretary. Given everything we've heard so far this morning, Joe Wheeler is with us, the political and commentator, meteorologist as well, many strings to her bow, and Maxwell, Marlow, political commentator on the debate desk this morning. I just wonder, where do you think this debate kind of is, Joe? Because I'm hearing a lot of, we can't talk about it, or we shouldn't talk about it, or alternatively, this isn't just Pakistani grooming gangs. I mean, it is Pakistani gangs. There is no doubt about that. That is factually correct. And I don't think we should be saying, it's fine to say dial down the rhetoric, or, you know, let's have a sensible conversation about this. But we are having a sensible conversation about this on this station anyway. We're talking about the huge and dreadful and ongoing thing that this is, and people are fed up because you hear about Jim Campbell talking about this happened in 2011, 2010, etc. But we're here in 2025 and this is still a massive problem.
Absolutely. I think the public want honesty and transparency to start with. When Jim was talking about the victims, he said some of them don't know that they're victims. It's coercive control, and they've not realised it. Well, tell that to the girls who went to the police station, whose parents went to the police and said, this has happened, and the police did nothing, the CPS did nothing, and they're still waiting for some kind of justice 15 years later. That is outrageous. In any society, for this to have happened is disgusting. And I think we do want another inquiry. Maxwell was saying that actually he looked at the original one and it's actually quite good, but it's not enough and we didn't see it. And
it's interesting with the Alexis J report because it only mentions Rochdale, I should say, it only actually mentions that once, and it is into sort of paedophilia, child exploitation in general, but specifically on these gangs themselves. Is a national inquiry needed, a local inquiry? I mean, what is the solution here, Maxwell?
I mean, for me, I think there's a very good inquiry. The Ilford inquiry was very good. It was in and out, very quick. The Commissioner went to houses of victims.
Do you mean Telford rather than Ilford?
Oh, sorry, to Telford, yes, the Telford inquiry, sorry. Yeah. But this is the thing, I think you can execute them quickly, but you need the political capital. And what I'm worried about is that essentially the government's guts aren't there to do it. And they still want to implement a lot of the original inquiry's recommendations. The last government didn't implement all of them. I still think there's work to be done there. However, we cannot get around the fact this is a primarily Pakistani grooming gang problem in certain communities, and we need to be very explicit about that, absolutely. However, we shouldn't make such broad sweeping statements to say that this is all Pakistanis, this is all Muslims, whatever. I mean, speaking to some friends from those backgrounds, they are as horrified as we are. I mean, imagine the shame that it brings to those communities that there are actors going on.
But what about the community leaders? Where are the community leaders in all of this? Where are the imams coming out saying, this is totally unacceptable, nobody should facilitate this, nobody should turn a blind eye, this is dreadful stuff? I mean, there does need to be community leadership here. It can't just say, isn't this awful? It has to, you've got to be a bit of leadership here, doesn't there, Joe?
So who's going to call for that? Who's going to ask the imams to come out and do that? Because if they don't believe that it's wrong, we need to know that too.
Yes.
We
correct.
need to understand that. Other than that, we need somebody to convey that message, as you say, to avoid triggering language or inflammatory language. We need somebody to come out and say, this may be predominantly because of Pakistani grooming gangs, but not all Pakistanis are like that, and that's not what they do.
And nobody's suggesting that either.
No.
And there's too much, to me anyway, I wonder what you think about this, Maxwell, but there's too much I'm not a racist but kind of language, or, I don't want to be racist, but I'm saying da-da-da-da. And I don't think people are being racist here. If something is a problem with a specific ethnic group, you can call that out and you can say, this is factually a thing. And we have a Wes Streeting, for example, who was, the Health Secretary, who was part of coming up with a definition around this for an all-party parliamentary group, just a group of MPs over the last a couple of years ago. And the suggestion was even to identify this with the Pakistani community was racist by itself.
Well, it happens on both sides. So that new definition also was the work of Anna Soubry, who was a Tory MP as well. So we see it on both sides of the House, and I think there's There is concern with politicians. Look, I can understand where Wes is coming from when he talks about political violence, and I know that a lot of MPs are very scared at the moment. Jess Phillips' interview, by the way, you know, she is getting death threats. That's certainly true. I know a lot of MPs who are getting death threats.
I don't want any MP to get a death threat.
Exactly.
I don't want Jess Phillips to get a death threat. I think, you know, we need to be responsible in what we do. But what they're going through, even with death threats, and I personally have received death threats for things I've said on this programme, and I mean, it's not nice.
Yeah. Well,
but at the same time, what the victims are going through is so much worse.
I completely agree. All I'm saying, I'm trying to explain where they are coming from when they're saying stuff like this. I do not think that there are MPs in the House who are seeing the massive fallout over this, whether that's from Elon, whether there is the thousands of emails they're getting from their constituents who are angry about this. I don't think they want to continue covering it up, to be honest. I really don't think so. I just think they're a bit lost where it comes from. And I think this idea that I'm not racist but, and adopting these definitions which are too broad, that's the real concern. So I think they need to sit down, have a real think about what they do next. Don't try and, you know, I think the Tories and Reform with their amendments to the education bill that went through, that were eventually quashed, I think we need to be having larger debates in the House about this, much larger debates, and also in the press as well, which I'm glad the press is doing.
Yeah, we are having the debate anyway. Joe?
In the paper this morning, there's a huge number of people in Britain who want another inquiry. But you say the first one was quite good. What are we going to achieve with the second one? Should we not be focusing now on the victims, the sentences that were given, or sentences to be given out for those found guilty in the future?
A lot of people say this isn't about an inquiry. This is actually just about implementing the law and the police doing their job. And there's far too many times when, you know, there have been investigations that have essentially regarded children as worthless and stupid little girls, when actually they weren't. They were telling the truth about what was happening to them.
Some of the accounts, 13-year-olds drunk a lot of alcohol with several men, and the police are saying that they gave consent, or they're just silly little drunkards.
Yeah.
How do we stop that?
You can't give consent if you're under 16. It's impossible. Yeah, it is rape, and it needs to be called what it is. And I do worry that we're, you know, I don't want a mosque massacre like the one in New Zealand. Obviously, we've got to be responsible in how we're talking. But I'm not sure Wes Streeting, I mean, does he have a point? Do you think do you think that the national debate is inflammatory around this, or people are just calling out what's there, Maxwell? What's your sense? I mean, it's hard to talk about the hundreds of thousands, millions of words that have been discussed on this in the last 10 days, but my sense of it is, and what I get from our viewers and listeners who are always talking common sense, is that actually it's just exasperation.
I wouldn't call it exasperation, actually. I'd say it's the step worse than anger. It's disgust. And I think a disgusted nation is one which is will be using inflammatory language because they want to express themselves really clearly, and they're not feeling like their representatives are doing that. So I think there is a risk that we could be looking at very inflamed community tensions. I think it's down to those communities of which are accused to step up and, you know, really call out what happened. Those communities discuss and anger with what happened and try and come together and try and form a way forward. And you're right, Peter, I'd like to see community leaders from these groups come out and suggest next steps.
Final word from Joe on this.
I think there just needs to be some kind of structure going forward. One, to look back at what happened, apologies, to be honest, for the victims, and some recognition of what they went through, because they have been ignored and swept under the carpet. And many of them, I've listened to them recently, are still suffering now, even though all this happened many, many years ago.
And some of it's ongoing now.
Absolutely. And the next thing is we make sure it never, ever happens again.
Thank you to Steve Smedley, who's been in touch, who says Streeting is terrified of losing his seat and jumping on the far-right line again. Disgraceful politicking as usual, and he'll still be booted out as the Muslim vote will only grow. This person's on, Lorraine says on Streeting telling us to stop talking about the Pakistani Muslim rape gangs because it may incite violence highlights the level these Labour politicians will stoop to, says this person, says Lorraine, in order to protect their own seats. The level of violence and depravity that these white children are suffering is beyond comprehension, and no longer should these innocents be sacrificed on the altar of political game playing. Streeting's attitude is deplorable, but not surprising considering some appalling posts he's made about other people in the past, including John Moyer, Chris Woodhead and Susan Hall. Well, I'm familiar with those posts and they are certainly controversial. Another person says, if people in certain communities are fearful of reprisals because of the gang rape accusations, they should stamp this filthy, vile behaviour out themselves in those communities. Jackie says, I cannot believe what I'm hearing. There's a vast difference between sexual abuse and grooming gangs, which is organised rape, and torture gangs. Victims have realised they're being abused and the police have done nothing. Thank you to Mary, who says that this is how crime detection works. You look for patterns, you deploy covert, overt and intelligent gathering methods, you start targeting and profiling. Pakistani Muslim men abusing young white girls, stop cars with Pakistani men driving around with young white girls if they're under 16. You suspect possible grooming, start an investigation, involve parents, involve social services. Police in many places shrank back from normal policing methods, particularly profiling and targeting, because bosses were running scared of racism claims. Jim Gamble, who we spoke to a little bit earlier, has been in touch because Joe Wheeler and Maxwell Marlow are here on the debate desk today, and Jim has been watching what Joe has said and has been in touch with us to say, shocked to hear that Joe suggests that my point regarding some victims don't know they're victims because of the grooming and coercive control, alongside tell that to the girls and their parents who went to the police. I, of course, addressed this and was clear that it was some victims. So we're happy to make that clear from Jim Gamble's perspective. Joe, just a final thought on this. What do we do now? How do we go forward with this? Or perhaps you want to react to what Jim says?
I would just say to Jim, I agree with him, and also with the point that I made. Some people know that they're victims and they went to the police. There are others that were kind of absorbed into the group and chose to stay with them or chose to spend time with them. And those are the ones who were coerced, didn't really realise that it was wrong. Your listener who just said you pick up Pakistani men with white girls in the back, if they're underage, then you throw everything at it to make sure that it's not ongoing. It's simple and it's straightforward and it deals with the problem, surely? Yes,
I agree with every single word you've said. There will be people who say, racial profiling, is that a good idea? I don't care if it stops the problem. I really don't care. I mean, you know, there were people who look like me, sound like me, from my background, who were stopped at airports and told, where are you going, sir, over the years. I'm happy enough with that, if that stopped terrorism for 1 second in regard to Northern Ireland terrorism. Profiling, I'm very relaxed about it. Maxwell, a final word on this.
Well, the gangs were profiling, weren't they? So this is the amazing thing, is that, you know, we can't enforce the law because of wishy-washy concerns from police. I think this needs to be turned around immediately.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to continue talking about this as the show goes on. You want to get your voice on the air? You give me a ring. 0344 499 1000. That's the number to call. There are a number of other stories around today that I want to talk about on the debate desk here with Maxwell and Joe, but we're not going to ignore this story. We are one of the few media outlets that have not ignored this story. We've talked about it consistently since the 1st of January. It's now the 11th of January. We'll talk about it till the 31st of December if you want us to. You let us know what you want us to talk about, because this is my show, but it's your show too. You want to talk about rape gangs? We'll talk about it till the cows come home, because something needs to be done. 0344 499 1000. Let's talk about the supply of gas that is in this country, because it has been cold recently. One person who knows all about that is Joe Wheeler. He's not just a political commentator, but a meteorologist as well, and has been keeping us right up to date across this station in terms of what's happening. Why is there so little gas, and what is your thought on this in terms of how we keep people warm, Joe?
Well, first and foremost, I saw the headline this morning, you know, less than a week's gas. And obviously, everybody's concerned. The cold weather, it got down to, I think, minus 19.7 last night in Altnahara, which is pretty chilly by anybody's standards.
Where's that?
Northern Scotland.
Right, OK, I thought so, yeah.
But right across the country, sub-zero, and places have got freezing fog, so temperatures won't rise above freezing during the day. And suddenly, there's a threat of only having 7 days' worth of gas, and it's like, oh no, what are we going to do? And this is on top of the pensioners who can't afford to heat their homes. So I read this story, and basically it's Centrica, who would like the government to invest £2 billion into their stores off the East Coast, which shut in 2017 when the government said it was too expensive, and now they want to reopen, or sorry, they are now reopened partially, but only at a fifth of capacity. So we need that investment. Obviously, the trend is towards net zero and using sustainable power, but since we don't have that and can't do that, and to take my word for it, things are calming down with the weather, so your wind turbines aren't going to be much good to you for the next 2 weeks or so. We need something else.
Are we going too quickly towards net zero, do you think, Jo?
Absolutely. Not least of all because I have no doubt that there are new technologies being developed which are more efficient.
Never buy the prototype. Go do a few versions in and get it sorted.
Of course. So I think there may be other solutions in the future. To be green and sustainable would be absolutely wonderful, but it's just not possible at the moment.
I think Jo has a point, don't you, Maxwell, that I don't think there are too many people who are not happy to do their bit, recycle a little bit, you know, do what needs to be done, but net zero and what Ed Miliband wants to do and the fact that, you know, there's only a week of supply left, that is all part and parcel, really, of the fact that we're moving very, very quickly to something that is fundamental change economically, environmentally, in so many different ways. Is Miliband moving too quickly?
Way too quickly. We're familiar every year, every December, with the NHS is in crisis. We're going to have exactly the same thing with our energy supplies if things do not change too quickly. I mean, let's look at why this crisis is happening currently. Yes, there's a capacity problem from Centrica and our general infrastructure. But there's also, we have exported our energy sovereignty. So part of the reason why there's a shortage, it's very cold in Texas at the moment, where we import a lot of our liquid natural gas. The fires in California, where a lot of the refining goes on, that stops a lot of production. We've also just put sanctions on Russian energy companies, and yes, I'm completely in favour of that, but there's a general supply of gas, which that is going to hold up. We're also competing with the Chinese and the Indians for that gas because they can't produce it on themselves. So we're just kind of this little player in the corner who've chosen to not do any fracking, even though we've got one of the most abundant supplies of shale in Europe, and also we've decided to stop issuing new oil and gas licences in the North Sea. So we are choosing completely consciously to cause this crisis continually. So we need to drill, baby, drill, to quote Donald Trump, you know, get those fracking stations open across the Midlands and the north of England, and also to invest more in our North Sea oil.
Jo, final word on this?
Quite simply, basically what Maxwell
he said.
It's what he said. Sorry, he did say he was going to ask me about the cold of
I was going to say, yeah.
parts
So
of America.
What is going on with that, Jo?
Yeah, well, that was a bit of a polar spill. So there's a vortex which keeps all the polar air in the far north, and it spilled down into those central parts of America. So
there we go.
That's where the cold came from. But I mean, we do need we need to create our own fuel. We need to have our own resources. How come China is opening power stations, coal-fired power stations?
All the time, and getting ahead of us economically.
Yeah,
Rachel Reeves is there at the moment.
And we're trying to buy it in.
Yeah.
It's just stupid. We have these resources, we have these facilities, we're just not using them.
Jo and Maxwell will be back in a second. Let me just read a couple of messages here. Leslie has been in touch and said, is Wes Streeting advocating shutting down the debate on grooming? That's how these girls were let down by the likes of Streeting, not wanting to face facts. Also, one of the long-standing issues in our society, says Dawn in Chelmsford, is that police, social services, education, probation, etc. always talk about interagency working. The reality is that they work in silos and victims fall through the gaps. Dawn, I have seen in government, when I worked in government for 3.5 years, how often different bits of government, different bits of the state don't work together. They have their own agendas. They often don't do that in lots of different ways, not just in that particular area. Also, Benny in Belfast has been in touch, has a bit of a policing bent with this one. Such investigations into grooming gangs were too hard for police. They took up too many resources, and the institutional misogyny of the police meant these children were regarded as worthless. Councils also shied away from robust social services action because their fear of being accused of racism. Resources also stretched. We have gross institutional failure, laziness and complicity on a grand scale. They're predominantly white police officers, detectives and social workers who have no inroads into these Muslim communities, who do not engage with them. Hello, immigration, we reap what we sow. Lots in that, lots more to debate between now and 12 o'clock. 0344 499 1000. We'll be back in the debate desk with Maxwell and Jo in just a minute here on Talk. Well, there's trouble at Mill for Reform UK because 12 Reform UK councillors have announced they're going to resign in protest against Nigel Farage. They've branded the party leader of Reform UK disloyal and autocratic. The resignations could add to pressure on him. Of course, we've had Elon Musk saying that Nigel Farage isn't up to the job. He says that Rupert Lowe, who's one of the MPs for Reform UK, should take over. There are certainly problems for Nigel Farage in a number of directions, but in other directions you can say, well, yeah, he's got over 150,000 members of Reform UK, he's got 5 MPs, and in the local elections things are looking good for them, certainly in terms of the polls. There is one poll recently that put Reform as the most popular political party in this country. The councillors that are involved with this say they'll jump ship. They hold 2 district council seats, 9 town council seats and 5 parish council seats. All are from Derbyshire and include a guy called Alex Stevenson. He came second in Amber Valley, beautiful part of the world in Derbyshire, actually, Amber Valley. During the general election, he got 28% of the vote. They said they could not continue in good conscience under Nigel Farage's leadership. On the debate desk, Maxwell, Marlow and Joe Wheeler are still with me. Maxwell, what do you make of this?
Let's look into some of these councillors who are looking to resign. I have spoken to the Reform team. I've asked them, you know, what is going on here? This seems very concerning.
You've done some research.
I've done some research. I know.
It's not just an opinion off the top of your head.
Definitely not. Unfortunately not. No. I've looked into it. So Reform tell me that some of these councillors are suspended because they were forging DNO certificates. Allegedly forging DNO certificates. And after the last election, where we saw a real crisis for Reform, where some of their candidates weren't as well vetted as they would have liked, they've tried to step it up. So Reform have told me that you know, some of these guys are allegedly forging certificates, and they'll probably be suspended.
What are DNO certificates?
So they essentially like background checks, right? So if some councillors or candidates have failed the background check, allegedly, some of the gentlemen were forging the certificates to say yes, they can go forward. Okay. So that's what Reform has said.
Any time you see anybody resigning from a political job, there's always something else. These are just allegations. We're not saying anybody's done anything.
Exactly.
We're simply saying that there's always more to it, isn't there, Joe?
Agreed. I'm glad that Maxwell did the research. That's helped both of us out this morning. Because I looked at this and I thought, this has the feeling of an ambush to it. I mean, Reform is a relatively new party. It's going great guns. Its membership has increased, you know, hugely. And it's doing very well in the polls. Of course, Richard Tice stood aside for Nigel. And Nigel Farage is a magnificent personality as far as I'm concerned. Whether you like him or whether you loathe him, you know, I don't think...
He communicates like very few others. He connects. He connects with people.
He does. And when this criticism came from Musk, again, I was quite shocked. Well, not just what are you doing in UK politics, but why are you having a pop at Nigel Farage?
He has a right to have an opinion, though, doesn't he?
Of course he does. I totally agree. It was just rather interesting. I mean, obviously, they've got a lot going on in the States at the moment, aren't they? Busy? Is there not the 20th coming up? Are there something going on that day?
It's interesting, just on the... I mean, a lot of our viewers and listeners are Reform UK supporters, and it's interesting that Ben Habib, the former joint deputy leader, they seem to be supporters of his. They said he was unceremoniously dumped. They say that Ben Habib truly represents the vision and values that drew us to Reform UK. I mean, whatever the truth of this, whatever the ins and outs, and there's always some sort of Byzantine kind of reasons for these things, the fact is that, factually, Nigel Farage is someone who annoys a lot of people. I mean, you look at his time in UKIP, you look at the time in the Brexit Party, quite a number of people resigned, left under his leadership. The evidence is there to suggest that historically he's not someone who can hold an organisation together. Could there be trouble ahead here, Joe?
I'm not sure whether there's trouble ahead. I mean, losing Ben Habib was awful, and I think I was listening to your programme the other day. Some lady called saying, I've been desperate to get hold of you, you know, come back. And he said, I'm not entirely sure whether Central Office would like that. But of course, Nigel Farage, he was out in the States with Donald Trump, you know, with the successes there. And the fact that Habib has gone, and now 12 councillors have gone, does cause people to turn around and say, hang on a second, what's happening with Reform? As I say, very popular. Yeah. I think their politics supersede either Labour or Conservative at the moment, because the country is looking for something else. You know, when we were talking about the gangs earlier, is Reform promising to do something about that? And if they did, will they deliver? Because nobody else has done. This has gone on for a long time. We've had no answers. We've talked about the energy crisis. It's all obfuscation and net zero and no real plans what to do when we are all sitting shivering in our houses. Can Reform deliver? If they can, will they? And
in a sense, actually, do these rows about a few councillors actually matter if Reform UK is, it's clearly going great guns in the polls? We'll see what happens in the local elections. A number of local authorities councils basically have to decide whether they're moving into a different model and whether certain elections will happen and so on. But there will be elections in May, and all the evidence we have, Maxwell, is that Reform will do very well.
Yeah, well, the elections that are going ahead, of course, have been cancelled. On the Ben Habib question, I think just to think about this a little bit more in detail, is that Ben Habib didn't win his seat, and it's quite hard to have a deputy leader who isn't sitting in the House alongside Rupert or Lee or James. I just think that's a little bit concerning, to be honest, because, yes, Ben, left and it wasn't under the best circumstances, but I can kind of see why he was kicked out, because if he didn't win his seat, it's really hard to then come back in.
I can see why they perhaps removed him as deputy leader, but the way it seems to have been done, we're getting into the weeds now of how things are. But, speaking of excellent communicators, Ben Habib is one of those people who communicates really, really well, and I think there are very few, actually, who communicate as well as he does.
And I think the Reform team are upset that it's gone the way it has. He, as your listeners know, as you know, he was very much loved and is very much loved, and that's why we keep going back to him. Ben. Okay. So I think this is a bump in the road. I don't think it's going to stop them from achieving what is likely to be a large amount of success in the coming elections. Well,
we will see what happens with Reform UK. Thank you both very much indeed, Maxwell, Marlow and Joe Wheeler, political commentators both. Joe, of course, is a meteorologist as well, keeping us up to date with what's going on.